Churches can be sites of divination, haunted locations and important community hubs. Yet in Wallsend, Holy Cross Church is notorious for a tale of witches and heroic daring-do. The ruin might not look like it now, but appearances can be deceptive. Because it's not just a chapel. We need to throw in a midnight ritual, grotesque women, a desecrated corpse and an infamous lord for good measure. Is it fact, folklore or total fiction? Let's explore the legend of the Witches of Wallsend in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are continuing with the Folklore of Churches month, and off the back of Enon Chapel, which was our notorious church from last week, we are sort of having a look at a notorious church this week, although I think it's far less notorious than Enon Chapel. And apologies for anyone who found the Enon Chapel one particularly disgusting, but it was amazing how many people messaged me to say they'd never actually heard of it, so I think that at least it adds a little bit extra depth, shall we say, to some of London's history, even if that depth was actually missing from the crypt, but never mind. We're off to Wallsend, which is obviously far closer to my neck of the woods, being in North Tyneside, and yes, it was named because it was the original end of the wall for Hadrian's Wall. I have heard some stories that say that the wall actually went all the way along to Tynemouth, which would make a lot more sense, but for our purposes here, Hadrian's Wall ended at Wallsend. And I did tell you that Northerners do tend to name things in quite a literal fashion, as you will have noticed in the Folklore of Names month that we recently had. But anyway, on with this week's story. So where is Holy Cross Church and what is it basically? Well, also known as the Church of the Holy Cross, some sources say that the monks from Jarrow Priory across the Tyne built the church in 1145, and many of the stones likely came from nearby Hadrian's Wall. It's actually what historic England call a medieval parochial chapel, and these chapels were built between the 12th and 17th centuries for parishioners who lived too far from their nearest parish church to be able to easily attend services. So in this case, Holy Cross Church acted as Jarrow's chapel in Wallsend. Now the chapel actually closed in 1797, although the last burial in its churchyard took place in 1842. And people often abandoned chapels either when their community disappeared or finances dried up. William Clark of Wallsend Hall nearby wanted to restore the church in the early 19th century, but after removing its roof, he sold the hall and then abandoned the restoration of the chapel, which was nice of him. St Peter's Church in Wallsend ultimately replaced Holy Cross Church, which is now a scheduled ancient monument, and the ruins lie near Valley Gardens and north of the Wallsend Burn, which incidentally flows past what is left of Willington Mill, which I do have an entirely separate episode on. Now, I wanted to give you some background to the legend before we start, because according to the Monthly Chronicle of North Country Lore and Legend, Sir Francis Blake Delaval originally told the tale of the Witches of Wallsend. That said, he died in 1771 and apparently had a bit of a once upon a time feel about it. So it must have occurred sometime before he died, obviously. But if it did occur, because we will go into Delaval's trustworthiness as a narrator later on. M.A. Richardson, writing in 1843, referred only to one of the Lords of Seaton Delaval as being the hero of the tale, so we've got a little bit of consternation about who the Lord actually is. So I've actually combined the salient points from the two major sources, which is Richardson and the Monthly Chronicle. They mostly agree with the Monthly Chronicle, even lifting sections from Richardson. Incidentally, they don't credit him, so that's just terrible plagiarism. But the main difference is the disagreement over the hero's identity. I'm going to simply call him our hero because we can't be sure who it actually was, and that already speaks volumes about the story's veracity. But let's get into the legend itself. Our anonymous adventurer had been in Newcastle and was apparently returning home after nightfall. He passed the ruins of Holy Cross Church on his way, but was surprised to see lights inside. Given there was no reason for anyone to light up the ruined church at that hour, or indeed any hour, our hero went to investigate. Leaving his horse at the gate with a servant, he made his way through the churchyard and up to the church. Peering in the window, he saw a hellish sight. A female corpse lay on the communion table, partially unwrapped from her burial shroud. A human skull stood upside down at each corner of the table, housing a bright flame. A number of old women sat around the table making charms, although one of them stood cutting away the corpse's left breast. One source described her as having, and I quote, a stubbly beard, ugly buck teeth, red fiery eyes, and withered wrinkled skin, end quote, likening her to one of the witches from Macbeth. Our hero decided he could not put up with this desecration of a church, and that these old women had a date with the stake. He burst into the church, and I am imagining Aragorn throwing open the doors of Helm's Deep at this point, and ran inside. The old women understandably each tried to flee, with some climbing up the walls and disappearing out through openings in the belfry. Others ran out of the door. Yet our hero managed to grab the woman who'd been dissecting the corpse and used his handkerchief to bind her hands behind her back. He managed to get her outside, where he threw her onto his horse behind his servant. Somehow, the story isn't clear how, he managed to get her to trial, although no one knows where since the story isn't specific. Apparently, whichever court saw her, if any, condemned her as a witch and sentenced her to be burnt at the stake on the beach near Seaton Delaval. What allegedly happened next was so bizarre that even the Monthly Chronicle begged their, and I quote, readers to take it as we ourselves do with a grain of salt, end quote. The witch asked for 2 brand new wooden dishes as a last request, which obviously in and of itself seems a little bit odd, but bizarrely someone fetched them from nearby Seaton Sluice. The authorities tied her to the stake, and while somebody else built up the fire around her, they gave the witch the dishes. She put a foot in each dish, and while the smoke rose around her, she recited a charm, the bindings fell away, and she soared away, riding the dishes to freedom. Well, not quite. For some reason, the person who gathered the dishes had dipped one of them in pure water, and her magic wore off too quickly. The dish refused to obey her charm and simply dumped her onto the ground. The authorities seized her, tied her to the stake, and burned her as planned, obviously unwilling to let her escape a second time. And that is where the legend of the Witches of Wallsend ends. So who was Sir Francis Blake Delaval? I did obviously mention him earlier and said he wasn't very trustworthy, and I have no idea why he hasn't got a Netflix series yet. But he was born on 16th of March 1727 and died on 7th of August 1771. Oxford educated, Sir Francis is nearly always described as notorious due to his role in the family described as the Gay Delavals. Gay here obviously meaning in that joyful 18th century sense of the word. Captain Blake Delaval's eldest son, he moved to London and fell in with a company of actors. Sir Francis frittered away his money on gambling, socialising and his mistresses, although he did manage to con Lady Isabella Paulet, a rich elderly widow, into marrying him, and then wasted her money as well. He spent some £1,500 to hire London's Drury Lane Theatre just to mount a version of Othello, and this was also a man who played practical jokes on his guests at Seaton Delaval Hall, such as rigging up a series of pulleys so that anyone getting into bed would be deposited through a trapdoor into a bath of cold water below. Hilarious, I'm sure. Now, Sir Francis also spent time as a soldier and even led a charge up the beach on the French coast. For this, he was considered a hero, despite the fact that, as many of the reports point out, there wasn't really a huge amount of resistance to his charge, but he earned the Knight of the Bath honour. Sadly, despite all of this, he became an alcoholic and died alone, leaving behind at least 5 illegitimate children and plenty of debts. Now, given his propensity towards amateur dramatics and his positioning of himself as a hero, it is very likely that he would cast himself as the hero in the tale of the Witches of Wallsend. If that is, he actually told the story at all. Remember, Richardson in 1843 simply names a Lord of Delaval, not specifically Sir Francis, and it's not until 1888, over a century after he died, that the Monthly Chronicle ascribes the story to him at all. So is the story of witches at Holy Cross Church true? Well, to be honest, this version of the legend is probably not true, for various reasons. Now, first, we can't really take Delaval's word on anything, let alone something like this, and I've just gone through why he would not be a particularly trustworthy narrator. Second, at the point when our hero beholds the awful sight inside the church, the version recited in the Monthly Chronicle switches to referring to our previously anonymous adventurer as Delaval himself. In Richardson's earlier account, as I said, the adventurer is not specifically named and is merely one of the Delavals. Third, burning witches at the stake was not a punishment conducted in England, and if we also believe Sir Francis and actually take his account as a first-person account, we also need to remember that a new Witchcraft Act had passed in 1735. This one not only meant it was illegal to claim anyone actually had magical abilities or was a practising witch, it also abolished executions of witches. Now, that's not to say that people didn't still believe witches existed. They likely still believed in magic and described bad luck that befell them to being overlooked or cursed by a witch. But it just meant that the witchcraft was legally an insult to the Enlightenment rather than being a criminal act in and of itself. And as I say, people weren't being executed as witches. True, Richardson's source does specify that no one knows which legal authority or hero prevailed upon to try the witch, but it does make the story a little shaky. Because if Delaval did burn the woman, then she could not have been legally considered a witch, as the law no longer recognised witches, which would just make it plain murder to burn someone at the stake. Indeed, Alan Fryer points out that while powerful families got powers to issue capital punishment through manorial courts during the Norman period, that mostly applied only to stealing. So for these reasons, we can basically look at the story and go, that doesn't seem like it actually happened. So what about Holy Cross Church itself? Because obviously this is Folklore of Churches Month. Well, the inclusion of Holy Cross Church is a bit of an odd plot point itself, because for a Lord of Delaval to return to Seaton Delaval from Newcastle, going via Wallsend would mean heading along what is now the coast road to Tynemouth, passing Wallsend, and then heading up what is now the A19 to Seaton Delaval. Now, I did actually check a map from 1794, so don't ever say that I don't know how to have a good time, but there were actually routes that would take you to Seaton Delaval from Newcastle via Wallsend, so it's not the weirdest route that you could take ever, but it does seem a little bit like you'd be going out of your way to do it. But why Holy Cross Church itself? Well, any church would have been bad enough, since the witches using it for their ritual demonstrated their profane tendencies. Desecrating a holy place would show just how low they would stoop to serve the devil. At least we assume that the devil's involved, because he doesn't actually make an appearance in this story. I will point out that the closure of the chapel in 1797 is an interesting one, since Richardson's account stressed that the church was a ruin at the time, and Sir Francis died in 1771. So how it could be a ruin in Sir Francis's day when it was still in operation remains to be seen. Now, of course, the legend could simply include a church, since Agnes Sampson confessed to attending rituals at a church in North Berwick. Here, Sampson and her coven, and I'm saying that in massive air quotes, allegedly summoned the devil, if you believe the accusations made during the Scottish witch trials. So perhaps the Wallsend story took its inspiration from that very well-known and shocking episode in Scottish history. Indeed, burning witches occurred in Scotland, so maybe the burning of the supposed witch on the beach at Seaton Delaval was likewise inspired by the Scottish stories. Of course, we also have the story of Tam O'Shanter, which involved witches in their church having their various revelries and what have you. That being said, Lenora at the Haunted Palace blog does note a genuine witchcraft accusation in 1570 in Wallsend. 2 people accused Janet Perrison. Neither actually accused her of anything malicious. One said she made belts to protect people from fairies, while the other said she used charms to cure a little boy, which is hardly conjuring the devil with a corpse in a church, is it? Leonora also points out that it could well be somebody had it in for Perrison's family, and that was where the accusation came from. So again, it's difficult to know if this tiny kernel of truth of this accusation of a witch in Wallsend somehow sat there within the popular imagination and then was combined with these other elements, being the church itself, Sir Francis's reputation, maybe a story that Sir Francis actually did tell, we don't know, and all of this just combined to give us the legend of the Witches of Wallsend. So what I want to know is, what do you think? Do you think the legend might have a kernel of truth in it? I don't think we can say that it actually happened as Sir Francis said it did, for all the plot holes that have been poking in it in this particular story. What is interesting is the fact that obviously the ruins are still there. They are very, very sparse indeed. And obviously they're not necessarily something that you really walk past as a passerby now. But they are a scheduled ancient monument, so people are at least still aware of them. Feel free to jump on the comments wherever you are and let me know what you think. Do you think that there might have been a kernel of truth in all of this after all? Or do you think it's just a really, really good adventure story of somebody doing something apparently heroic based on perhaps a fashion for stories of witches and whatnot? Anyway, let me know what you think. Next week, we're going to be having a look at church curiosities. So these will be things that you can look out for in churches. So that's things like graffiti, interesting door knockers, which is more interesting than it sounds, I promise, and things like that. I won't be covering Rosslyn Chapel in its many bits and pieces, because I do have a bonus episode about that specifically on Patreon for Patreon supporters. But I will make that episode available for sale if anybody specifically just wants to hear that one, because Rosslyn Chapel has a lot of folklore attached to it and a lot of legends. So as I say, I will make that one available for sale separately through Patreon. Otherwise, if you do become a supporter, I can't remember how many bonus episodes there are now, but I'm sure there's around about 60 or so. So there's plenty to get your teeth into if you do decide to support on Patreon. And obviously Patreon support does help me to pay for things like website hosting and the software I use to send my emails to subscribers, and basically also covers my time and research sources and things, because obviously I do sometimes have to pay for books and so on. So obviously being a Patreon supporter does basically help to keep the lights on. Other than that, as I say, we will be looking at those church curiosities next week, so that should be quite an interesting one. There are some really cool bits and pieces around the country, so I hope to see you next week when we have a look at them. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.